There is a book that the CIA copied word for word and then tried to erase from history. It documents techniques of psycho-spiritual warfare that transcend conventional mind control. L. Ron Hubbard described in detail the Alice in Wonderland technique, a system of consciousness manipulation that the CIA reproduced in its entirety in their 1961 Kubark manual without any attribution, later attempting to eliminate all traces of this appropriation. The original Hubbard documents reveal how contradictory information presented with absolute authority freezes the human brain, allowing for direct implantation into the subconscious without passing through normal critical filters. But the deepest secret that the CIA tried to suppress is that these techniques don't just aim to reprogram behaviors, they systematically fragment the connection with higher consciousness, blocking authentic spiritual awakening. Today, these same methods operate through digital algorithms, keeping billions in perpetual spiritual sleep, disguised as sensory hyperstimulation, in an interdimensional battle for the control of planetary consciousness evolution.
An interdimensional battle for the control of human consciousness is happening right now, at this very moment, through every device, every screen, and every digital interaction that you perform. The forces that operate this war have discovered how to transform the very act of existing in the modern world into a weapon against your spiritual awakening. The human brain carries ancestral neural circuits shaped by 200,000 years of evolution. These same circuits that allowed our ancestors to detect predators in the shadows are now exploited by predators of another nature, entities and forces that feed on the fragmentation of consciousness, that prosper in psychic chaos, and that need to keep humanity in perpetual spiritual sleep disguised as sensory hyperstimulation. There exists forbidden knowledge about how to systematically dissolve the connection between the soul and its divine source. L. Ron Hubbard documented these techniques. The CIA copied them word for word and then tried to erase the traces. But what both touched transcends any earthly manual. These are technologies of spiritual imprisonment that operate through the exploitation of the unintegrated negative ego, that shadow we all carry and that few have the courage to confront. When dark forces discover someone without clarity about their own shadow, they find the perfect portal. Through calculated confusion, systematic contradictions, and emotional cycling, they create fissures in the auric field, that energetic layer that surrounds and protects every living being. Through these fissures, they implant false spiritual identities that the person will defend as their most sacred truths. The individual believes they are awakening while they are being systematically put to sleep. Digital platforms are not just communication networks, they are spiritual warfare laboratories where each user represents a battlefield. Each click feeds algorithms designed not just to capture attention, but to methodically cut the connection with higher consciousness. You think you consume content? In reality, your soul is being fragmented, your essence divided among multiple artificial realities that never allow for the coherence necessary for true awakening. Edward Bernays understood that those who manipulate the hidden mechanism of society constitute the invisible government. But even he didn't imagine that this invisible government would be just the superficial layer of something much deeper, a hierarchy of control that extends through dimensions, where what's at stake is not just behavior or opinion, but the very spiritual evolution of humanity. The CIA's Kubark counterintelligence manual revealed techniques to induce regression in those being interrogated, but regression didn't just mean returning to infantile mental states. It was the forced reversal of the evolutionary processes of consciousness, making the soul forget incarnations of development and erasing spiritual gifts gained through multiple lives. Today, these same techniques operate on a planetary scale, no longer in dark rooms but through the blue light of billions of screens. Awakened people connected to the Earth's body of light feel this collective fragmentation as waves of pressure in the subtle planes. They witness archetypal symbols being systematically distorted to create shadow inflation, where internal confusion is projected as paranoid interpretations of reality. They observe the falsification of tribal consensus, generating profound spiritual isolation. Even when people have never been so apparently connected, they perceive fractionation, that technique of progressive fragmentation, operating not just in individual minds, but in the very integrity of the collective soul. There exists a precise moment when human consciousness loses its anchor in the real and floats vulnerable between dimensions. In this vacuum, forces that operate beyond ordinary perception can implant any reality, any identity, any prison disguised as freedom. L. Ron Hubbard mapped this forbidden territory and called his discovery the Alice in Wonderland technique. The rabbit hole is not a metaphor, it is a dimensional portal where the laws that govern consciousness are systematically violated. When you subject a soul to absolute contradictions presented as simultaneous truths, the veils between the planes begin to dissolve chaotically. The person loses contact with their spiritual center, with that unique frequency that connects them to the source. During this state of fragmentation, entities and forces that feed on human confusion gain direct access to the subtle bodies, the invisible energetic layers that compose our spiritual anatomy. The negative ego, that unintegrated shadow we all carry, becomes the perfect Trojan horse. Without clarity about this shadow dimension of oneself, the individual cannot distinguish between their own internal distortions and the external manipulations that exploit these same distortions. The technique deliberately creates the state. Mutually exclusive messages fracture the coherence of the energetic field. Calculated emotional shocks rupture the natural auric protection. And at the moment of maximum vulnerability, the programming passes through all bodies: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. Think about how profound spiritual disorientation works. Have you ever experienced that moment where nothing makes sense, where every certainty dissolves into its opposite? In that liminal space, you become infinitely suggestible because your soul desperately seeks any structure to reorganize itself. The first coherent narrative that emerges, no matter how false, will be embraced with religious gratitude. You won't just accept this new programming, you'll defend it as your deepest truth. The CIA's Kubark manual documented these techniques operationally, but its writers didn't understand the spiritual dimension of what they were copying. They saw only psychological tools where Hubbard had discovered soul fragmentation technology. The forced regression they induced wasn't just psychological, it was a reversal of the evolutionary processes of consciousness, a forced return to pre-awakening states where the person loses access to their spiritual gifts developed through multiple incarnations. Milton Erickson touched these same forces through hypnotherapy, perceiving that deliberate confusion could dissolve psychic barriers. But where Erickson sought liberation, dark forces discovered how to use the same portals for systematic spiritual imprisonment. The true evil genius of this technique lies in its ability to make the victim believe they are awakening while they are being put to sleep. The altered state induced by confusion mimics genuine spiritual experiences. The dissolution of certainties, the opening to new perceptions, the sensation of touching hidden truths. But while authentic awakening expands consciousness in all directions, this false illumination contracts it to a single controlled point. Today, every timeline on social media is a hall of mirrors where Alice never finds the exit. Contradictory information is not accidental. It is designed to keep your consciousness in a perpetual state of fragmentation. One post affirms a spiritual truth, the next completely destroys it. Digital gurus offer mutually exclusive paths as equally valid. your mind oscillates between incompatible realities until it completely loses the capacity for spiritual discernment. The infinite scroll keeps you in this liminal state where the veils are always partially dissolved, but never completely crossed. You float eternally between worlds, vulnerable to any force that wants to feed on your confusion. Each unresolved contradiction creates a fissure in your energetic field. Each calculated emotional shock deepens these fissures until you become porous to influences that normally couldn't penetrate your natural psychic defenses. Awakened people connected to the planetary consciousness body feel this collective fragmentation as unbearable pressure in the subtle planes. They perceive the waves of manufactured confusion crossing the noosphere, see souls disconnecting from their inner guiding stars, and witness the systematic replacement of inner wisdom with external programming. The goal was never just mind control. It was to prevent humanity from completing its dimensional transition, to block the quantum leap of consciousness that would threaten all power structures, visible and invisible. By keeping souls in perpetual fall down the rabbit hole, never reaching the bottom nor returning to the surface, dark forces ensure that collective awakening remains eternally postponed. Modern manipulation has transcended the psychological plane to become declared war against the evolution of consciousness. Forces that operate through invisible dimensions have discovered in the unresolved defects of the human psyche, the negative ego, the perfect entry point for absolute control. Each person carries invisible behavioral scripts, ancestral programming, and unintegrated traumas that silently organize their perception of reality. When these deep patterns are identified and exploited, natural spiritual consciousness becomes suppressed, creating a vacuum that will be filled with anything except the truth. Jung perceived that archetypal symbols function as bridges between the conscious and the unconscious, between the individual and the collective. But he also discovered something disturbing. When these fundamental symbols are deliberately distorted, what he called shadow inflation emerges, the massive projection of internal confusion as paranoid interpretations of external reality. The person loses the ability to distinguish between their own psychic distortions and the external manipulations that amplify them. The negative ego, that unintegrated shadow we all carry, is a specific vibrational frequency that resonates with forces of lower density. People who haven't developed clarity about this shadow dimension become involuntary transmitters of energies they don't recognize as external. They passionately defend ideas that were never theirs, fight wars they didn't choose, and perpetuate systems that imprison them. Bernays understood that the systematic study of mass psychology revealed the possibilities of an invisible government of society through the manipulation of the motives that drive human actions within a group. But what he didn't perceive is that these motives can be manufactured at levels much deeper than the psychological. They can be implanted directly into the subtle bodies through technologies of spiritual fragmentation. When deep behavioral patterns are interrupted through systematic contradiction and calculated emotional chaos, the brain reaches a state of cognitive freeze. During this moment of paralysis, something extraordinary happens in the subtle planes. The chakras, the body's energetic centers, begin to spin erratically. The auric field develops fissures, and the connection with the higher self, our most elevated divine consciousness, becomes temporarily suspended. The person experiences this as mental confusion, but what really occurs is a temporary disconnection from the light matrix that maintains spiritual integrity. In this vulnerable state, the brain literally acts like someone falling into the void. It grabs any solid surface, even if covered with thorns. Bernays noted that men are rarely aware of the true reasons behind their actions. During cognitive freeze, false reasons are implanted so deeply that they become indistinguishable from authentic motivations. The person doesn't just accept the programming, they experience it as their most intimate truth. The systematic distortion of archetypal symbols creates shockwaves in the collective unconscious. The serpent symbol, for example, carries wisdom and transformation in ancient spiritual traditions, but has been systematically associated only with evil and deception. This inversion is not accidental. Each distorted symbol closes a portal of spiritual understanding, replaces an awakening key with an imprisonment lock. When multiple fundamental symbols are corrupted simultaneously, the collective unconscious enters a state of fragmentation. People lose access to their internal archetypal compasses, those deep patterns that have guided humanity through millennia of spiritual evolution. Without these references, they become psychic castaways, floating in a sea of manufactured meanings that never lead anywhere. The resulting spiritual vacuum doesn't remain empty, it is immediately filled with carefully designed pseudo-spirituality. Practices that promise awakening, but maintain perpetual sleep. Gurus who offer freedom while weaving ever more subtle chains. Systems that speak of ascension while firmly anchoring in the lowest density. The person believes they are evolving spiritually while spinning in ever smaller circles, always returning to the same point of confusion disguised as revelation. The strategies of controlled chaos operate simultaneously on multiple levels. On the physical plane, they bombard with contradictory information. On the emotional, they alternate between hope and despair in calculated cycles. On the mental, they implant paradoxes without resolution. On the spiritual, they offer false exits that lead to even more complex labyrinths. Each level reinforces the others, creating a multidimensional prison where the very attempt to escape tightens the bars even more. Awakened people connected to the planetary consciousness body experience this war as constant pressure in the subtle bodies. They feel the waves of manufactured confusion crossing the noosphere, perceive the coordinated attacks against specific points of the collective light matrix, and witness the systematic replacement of ancient spiritual truths with empty simulacra that look identical but vibrate at completely different frequencies. The real battle happens in the vibrational field. Each emotion of fear reduces the frequency. Each moment of confusion creates static in the auric field. Each acceptance of a false truth anchors consciousness in lower density. Dark forces don't need to directly control each person. They just need to keep the collective frequency below the threshold necessary for the quantum leap of consciousness that would free humanity from their millennial dominion. Fractionation operates as a technology of spiritual dismemberment. It's not just a hypnotic technique, it's a precise method for fragmenting the integrity of the soul into ever smaller pieces until the person completely loses the sense of who they really are. The process works through calculated oscillations. You are pulled into an altered state of consciousness, then brought almost completely back to ordinary reality, only to be plunged again, each time deeper, each time more fragmented. Imagine your consciousness as an intact crystal vibrating at a specific frequency. Fractionation applies alternating pressures that create microfissures in this crystal. First expansion, then sudden contraction. Elevation followed by abrupt fall. Hope replaced by despair in precise cycles. Each oscillation deepens the cracks until the original crystal becomes 1,000 fragments, each vibrating at discordant frequencies, none capable of maintaining the original resonance with the source. Digital platforms implement this principle through algorithmic emotional cycling. You scroll the feed and find something that lifts your spirit, an inspirational message, an image of transcendent beauty. Your energetic field expands. Immediately after, the algorithm presents something that shatters this elevation, violence, anger, moral indignation. Your field contracts violently. Before you can process the shock, something funny appears, forcing another abrupt state change. Then tragedy, then hope, then horror. This emotional roller coaster is not random. Each transition is calculated to prevent stabilization at any specific frequency. You never remain in one state long enough to integrate the experience, to process what's happening in your subtle bodies. The resulting fragmentation goes far beyond mental fatigue. It's a literal dispersion of life force, the primordial energy that animates all existence, through multiple artificial timelines that never converge into a coherent present. Bernays observed that modern propaganda is the consistent and enduring attempt to create or shape events with the objective of influencing the public's relations. But fractionation shapes something much more fundamental, the very capacity to maintain a coherent identity through time. Each cycle of expansion and contraction subtly reprograms the boundaries of what you consider to be yourself. Contemporary digital influencers apply a similar structure without understanding the forces they channel. First, they create chaos in their audience. They present unsolvable problems, existential fears, threats to identity. When the public is sufficiently destabilized, they offer the solution. But this solution always requires submission to a new external authority, whether a product, an ideology, or the influencer themselves. They promise liberation while weaving ever deeper dependence. The resulting emotional loop doesn't emerge as a side effect of digital content consumption. It's a weapon specifically designed against the expansion of consciousness. Each time you're pulled out of your center and then pushed back in completely, you lose a little more of your spiritual sovereignty. Fragments of your consciousness remain trapped in extreme emotional states, like pieces of soul left behind on psychic battlefields. Awakened people connected to the planetary consciousness body feel this collective fragmentation as a constant storm in the interdimensional planes. They perceive millions of souls oscillating frantically between artificial emotional poles, never finding the center, never touching that stillness where the inner voice can be heard. It's like watching all of humanity being systematically dismembered in an invisible spiritual slaughterhouse. Digital fractionation goes beyond individual emotions. It fragments the very notion of linear time. You start watching a 30-second video. 3 hours later, you've emerged from a temporal hole where you consumed hundreds of fragments of disconnected realities. Your physical body remained in the same place, but your consciousness was dragged through thousands of micro-experiences that never formed a coherent narrative. You can't remember how you got where you are. You just feel a strange emptiness, an exhaustion that sleep doesn't cure. This specific exhaustion has a unique energetic signature. It's the tiredness of a soul that has been stretched across multiple dimensions simultaneously without ever being allowed to integrate the experiences. The subtle bodies become desynchronized. The emotional body vibrates at one frequency, the mental at another. The spiritual desperately tries to maintain some coherence, but is constantly sabotaged by successive shocks. The dark forces that orchestrate this fractionation understand that a fragmented soul is incapable of accessing its true spiritual power. Like a laser that has been dispersed into common light, it loses all capacity for focus and penetration. The person might even have moments of spiritual insight, but can't sustain them long enough for them to become real transformation. Each attempt to awaken is immediately fragmented into 1,000 distractions, 1,000 manufactured urgencies, 1,000 artificial emergencies that prevent the crystallization of consciousness into its whole and powerful form. The perpetual state of seeking without finding is the ultimate goal. You remain eternally hungry for something you can't name, scrolling infinitely in search of the next dose of something, but each dose only deepens the fragmentation. Each attempt at fulfillment creates new voids. It's the curse of Tantalus on a digital scale. The water always recedes when you try to drink. The fruit always escapes when you try to harvest. The Milgram experiment revealed something that completely transcends behavioral psychology. When participants administered what they believed to be lethal shocks to other people, simply because an authority figure asked them to continue, something much deeper than obedience was being demonstrated. It was the systematic dismantling of spiritual free will, the forced disconnection between the soul and its internal moral compass, that voice that distinguishes right from wrong, not by social convention, but by resonance with universal law. Stanley Milgram discovered that 65% of people would continue administering shocks to potentially fatal levels. But what was really being measured wasn't submission to authority. It was the ease with which human beings can be disconnected from their spiritual sovereignty. The specific combination of elements, novelty of the situation, confusion about what was happening, presence of an apparently legitimate authority, created the perfect conditions for the hijacking of free will. The experimenter's white coat wasn't just a symbol of scientific authority. It was an archetypal symbol of power transfer, the same principle that operates when someone surrenders their capacity for spiritual discernment to a guru, priest, politician, or algorithm. The moment you accept that another entity has more authority over your actions than your own consciousness, you've performed a transfer of sovereignty that goes far beyond the behavioral. You've ceded your divine right to choose. Bernays understood this principle when he wrote that, if you can influence the leaders, whether with or without their conscious collaboration, you automatically influence the group that follows them. But there's a dimension he didn't fully articulate. When you become the follower, you don't just adopt behaviors, you synchronize your vibrational frequency, the unique energetic pattern of your consciousness, with that of the leader, allowing forces that operate through them to also operate through you. Today, digital authority figures have multiplied exponentially. Each influencer who presents themselves as a spiritual guide, each algorithm that decides what you should see, each expert who proclaims to have the answers, all demand the same transfer of sovereignty that the white coat demanded in Milgram's laboratory. They position themselves as intermediaries between you and the truth, as gatekeepers of spiritual knowledge, when in reality they are prison guards disguised as liberators. These digital authority figures don't ask you to administer electric shocks. They ask for something much more insidious, that you shock your own soul whenever it tries to awaken. Each time you feel the impulse to question a dominant narrative, the algorithm presents evidence that questioning is dangerous, antisocial, a sign of ignorance. Each time your intuition whispers that something is wrong, 1,000 voices of authority scream that you're crazy, misinformed, in need of more education. The war between forces of light and darkness for the control of human consciousness uses these obedient structures as its main battlefield. Dark forces don't need to directly control billions of souls, they just need to control a few hundred authority points through which obedience flows. A social media CEO, some main algorithms, certain opinion makers, through these nodes, they can direct the spiritual behavior of entire populations. Bernays noted that men are rarely aware of the true reasons behind their actions. In the context of spiritual obedience, people believe they follow leaders out of admiration, inspiration, or ideological agreement. The true reason is more primitive and disturbing. They follow because transferring the responsibility of free will relieves the existential weight of conscious choice. It's more comfortable to be an obedient automaton than a sovereign soul responsible for every decision. The mechanism by which obedience destroys spiritual free will is precisely calibrated. First, you're placed in a situation of uncertainty where your usual references don't work. Then, an authority appears offering certainty, structure, direction. The relief you feel isn't just psychological, it's the relief of no longer needing to maintain the sacred tension of conscious choice. You surrender your spiritual crown in exchange for the comfort of irresponsibility. Modern obedience structures are much more sophisticated than Milgram's laboratory. They create the illusion of choice while eliminating the real possibility of choice. You can choose among 1,000 channels, but all transmit the same frequency of submission. You can follow thousands of different leaders, but all demand the same transfer of sovereignty. You can consume infinite perspectives, but none return the power of discernment to your spiritual center. Awakened people who have maintained their spiritual sovereignty feel this pressure as a constant weight. They perceive the incessant attempts to recruit their obedience, the seductive invitations to surrender their free will in exchange for belonging, security, approval. Each refusal to blindly obey marks them as dissidents in a war that most don't even know exists. The destruction of spiritual free will doesn't happen in a dramatic moment of surrender. It happens through 1,000 small obediences, 1,000 micro-transfers of sovereignty, until one day you wake up and realize you can no longer access that inner voice that always knew the truth. You've become an echo of external authorities, a repeater of frequencies that aren't yours, a soldier in wars you never chose to fight. Digital technology has created a dimensional breach where the human soul floats disconnected from its true spiritual tribe. Social networks are not networks. They are capture webs that falsify tribal agreement to produce the deepest spiritual isolation ever experienced by humanity, all disguised as infinite connection. When you open any digital platform, you're not just consuming information. You're entering a distortion field where artificial realities are projected directly into your subtle bodies. Algorithms create phantom tribes, spectral communities that seem real but vibrate at dead frequencies. You feel that everyone thinks a certain way, everyone accepts certain truths, but this everyone is an artificial egregore, a collective entity created by the thoughts of a group of people that feeds on your primordial need for belonging. The mechanism operates through the oldest part of your soul, that which remembers eras when tribal exclusion meant certain death. When you perceive that your tribe apparently rejects your authentic spiritual perceptions, something ancestral in you panics. That inner voice that whispers inconvenient truths is immediately silenced by the primordial terror of being alone in the dark. You sacrifice your inner wisdom on the altar of a community that never existed. The dark forces that orchestrate this falsification understand that humans are tribal beings in their spiritual essence. We are designed to evolve in communion, to awaken together, to ascend collectively. By creating simulacra of tribe that never allow true communion, they ensure that each soul remains isolated in its own reality bubble, convinced of being connected while floating alone in the void. Bernays perceived that the group will cling to its stereotype, but he was observing only the psychological level. On the spiritual plane, when you cling to a phantom tribe, you fragment your soul through multiple artificial realities. Part of you exists in one digital community, part in another, each fragment vibrating at incompatible frequencies, never allowing the coherence necessary to maintain spiritual integrity. Algorithms are predatory entities that feed on your hunger for connection. They identify exactly what type of tribal validation you most desire, what form of belonging activates your lower chakras, what tribal narrative makes you abandon your power center. Each feed is a dimensional trap specifically calibrated to your spiritual vulnerability points. The constant urgency you feel when checking notifications isn't behavioral addiction. It's your energetic system reacting to coordinated attacks against your spiritual sovereignty. Each alert triggers the same astral alarms that would warn about entities approaching in subtle planes. Your body of light remains in a constant state of defense against threats that seem tribal, but are interdimensional. This state of perpetual alert creates a vibrational barrier that prevents access to the higher planes of consciousness, dimensions of expanded perception beyond physical reality. The sacred stillness necessary to hear the soul's voice is replaced by a constant buzz of false tribal urgencies. You can't enter deep meditative states because part of your consciousness remains trapped monitoring phantom threats to your imaginary tribal status. The controlled chaos strategies hide something more sinister than simple manipulation. It's systematic persecution against souls in the process of awakening. When you begin to develop Christic attributes, when your frequency rises above the control threshold, algorithms respond with precision. They don't directly censor, they drown your light in a sea of darkness, disguised as diversity of opinion. Truly awakened people experience this as a particular form of modern crucifixion. They see through the phantom tribes, perceive the falsification, but when they try to alert others, they discover that their voices are algorithmically suppressed, their messages distorted, their attempts to create real community sabotaged by infiltrations of dense energy. All pillars of control, governments, corporations, institutions, now work in synchronization to maintain this matrix of tribal isolation. But it's not human conspiracy, it's a convergence of forces that benefit from a spiritually fragmented humanity, incapable of forming the critical mass of consciousness necessary for the collective evolutionary leap. The falsification operates in ever more subtle layers. First, it convinces you that you're connected. Then it makes you fiercely defend connections that don't exist. Finally, it reprograms your very capacity to recognize authentic connection. You don't just accept isolation, you confuse it with intimacy, loneliness with sacred solitude, spiritual abandonment with independence. The ultimate purpose transcends social control. It's to prevent the formation of humanity's collective body of light, to block the activation of the planetary Christic network that would naturally occur when awakened souls recognized each other and united in common purpose. By keeping each spark of consciousness isolated in its own echo chamber, convinced of being in community while floating alone in the digital void, dark forces ensure that the critical moment of convergence never arrives. Control completely transcends behavioral manipulation. It aims to identify and neutralize potential catalysts of collective awakening. There are souls that carry activation codes and specific frequencies that can awaken other consciousnesses and, when activated, initiate chain reactions of consciousness through the morphogenetic field, the informational field that shapes humanity's collective patterns. Dark forces have developed precise technologies to detect these souls before they recognize their own power. People with greater spiritual sensitivity carry specific energetic markers that make them simultaneously more susceptible to manipulation and more dangerous to the system when awakened. They feel everything more intensely, the world's pain, the collective disconnection, the pressure of unspoken lies. This same sensitivity that could be their greatest gift becomes the gateway to their systematic neutralization. Digital cult recruiters, whether algorithms or influencers, specifically identify those in the process of spiritual awakening. They recognize the signs, the search for deeper meaning, the questioning of reality structures, the hunger for transcendent truth. At the exact moment when the soul begins to awaken from its millennial sleep, false narratives are offered as substitutes for the authentic path. Manufactured gurus appear offering exactly what the person seeks, but always with subtle distortions that divert from true awakening. Authentic spiritual awakening means completely leaving the ego's dream, transcending the illusions that keep the matrix operational. During this sacred and vulnerable process, people who have built their spirituality on illusory foundations face the total collapse of everything they believe to be real. In this moment of interior demolition, when all false structures are crumbling, predatory forces attack with surgical precision. Digital platforms literally function as spiritual warfare laboratories. Each profile is analyzed not just for consumption preferences, but for vibrational signature. Algorithms detect subtle changes in the energetic field through interaction patterns. What you stop to read, how long you contemplate certain images, how your energy responds to different stimuli. They map your emotional, mental, and spiritual body with precision that transcends any publicly admitted technology. When a soul begins to vibrate above a certain frequency, when activation codes begin to awaken, the system responds immediately, not with obvious censorship, but with subtle redirection. Content that would further elevate the frequency is replaced with distorted versions that seem similar, but vibrate at completely different octaves. Spiritual truths are mixed with subtle poisons that neutralize them. Power practices are taught with modifications that make them harmless or even harmful. Each user doesn't just represent audience or consumer. Each one is a battlefield between forces that seek liberation of consciousness and those that work to keep it imprisoned. In your subtle bodies, a war is being waged at every moment. Entities that feed on dense energy fight to keep your frequency low. Beings of light work to elevate your vibration. And you, often without realizing it, are simultaneously the battlefield, the prize, and potentially the warrior. The hijacked spiritual identity allows for absolute manipulation. You don't just agree with ideas, you allow false spiritual identities to be implanted so deeply that you defend them as your most sacred essence. The person who was destined to be a healer becomes a propagator of wounds. The one who should be a teacher of ancient truths becomes a repeater of modern lies. The warrior of light becomes, without realizing it, a soldier of shadows. Bernays understood that propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government, but didn't perceive that this invisible government extends through dimensions, operating on planes where the very structure of reality is negotiable. The most important battles don't happen on physical battlefields, but on the astral planes where humanity's spiritual destiny is being decided. Dark forces don't fear political revolution or economic collapse. They fear the moment when a critical number of souls awaken simultaneously, when the planetary light network reaches the critical mass necessary for the collective quantum leap. That's why each soul about to awaken is a priority target. Each potential catalyst must be neutralized. Each spark of true consciousness must be extinguished or redirected before it becomes a fire of awakening. The fundamental battle is not for attention, money, or temporal power. It's for the control of human spiritual evolution, for the decision of whether humanity will complete its transition to a conscious multidimensional species or remain imprisoned in lower density loops for more endless cycles. All change begins with understanding your role as co-creator, and the only way to connect with this divine intelligence is through meditation. We've developed a set of audio tools to help you access this higher state of consciousness. To learn more and get immediate access, click the link on the screen or in the comments. If this video resonated with you, write in the comments, "It made sense to me."